control district. And pleased to be with you this evening. We wanted to share an update with you relative to the Campbell and Paintbrush flood corridors, as well as the rest of the area and what we've been working on. There's been a lot of activity, frankly, since the fire, but particularly a lot of activity over the last couple months, really moving swiftly into long-term mitigation mode, and obviously simultaneously dealing with response to the terrible flooding that's taken place. And I just want to acknowledge that, you know, there's been a lot of impacts. I will say though that thankfully in these corridors that we had the mitigation in place. It certainly had a very positive impact when you look at and understand that you're seeing anywhere from probably 5 to 10 times the level of flooding that, you know, was experienced even earlier in Schultz. That the volume of water increase is still pretty substantial beyond that, and the measures that are there are, as we were saying, are working overtime and have had a positive benefit. But we are looking at some potential improvements to these areas. And with me tonight is Alan Hayden with Natural Channel Design, and he'll be talking about the on-forest measures. And Chris Duza is with me tonight, and he'll be speaking to the off-forest in neighborhood measures and what we're looking at. I want to share that obviously we're very early in this process, and so you know, but we wanted to keep you informed. And what, you know, kind of key message out of tonight is really that we have some plans in place. They're early preliminary planning. But frankly, the key to everything is getting federal and state funding. The magnitude of funding that's needed now to address the level of flooding that we're seeing throughout the 9 watersheds is really significant. You're going to see that number. It's frankly kind of astounding. And it's far beyond what the district, flood control district and county could consume and invest in. And so we have to have federal and state funding. And fortunately, we have a lot of support at the congressional level, federal level, that's working with us to try to secure that funding, but it's all going to be contingent on securing that funding. So with that, we're going to launch into this evening. Excuse me. We'll launch into this evening, and the first person that I'd like to introduce is Louise Porter is with us this evening. Louise is the Public Information Officer for the Small Business Administration, and she works with their Office of a Disaster Assistance, and hopefully most of you are, if not all of you, are getting our email updates, our really regular email updates. And if you aren't getting those, I really strongly encourage you to email us. The email will be at the end of the presentation, and it's also on the Schultz/pipeline website. Email us and sign up to receive those. We put out a lot of information already. As I think you're probably all aware, the Small Business Administration has declared this area a disaster, and they're now here offering their low interest loan program, which I heard today, you know, a 30-year mortgage on a home is now over 7%, and they're offering rates at 1.6 and 3.1 or something like that. I mean, let's face it, if you can get money at 1.6%, that's free money. So we're strongly encouraging everyone to apply for these loans. You'll have 60 days to decide whether you want to accept that loan or not. And Louise is here, and she'll go into details about the program. And they have opened an office here at the County Health and Human Services building on King Street. And if you have questions or you want to go in and apply in person, you can go there, speak with the representatives from SBA. They're managing this program. The district is not. They're the experts, and they, we're getting very positive comments back about them being helpful with having these conversations. You can also go online, and they also have a call center. So, but anyway, I'll go ahead and turn it over to Louise, and we really thank Louise for being here. She flew in on a moment's notice and has been here since the 20th and has been doing a lot of communication work with us and with the media and the communities that have been impacted. So thank you, Louise, for joining us this evening.
Well, thank you so much for having me, Coconino County and Lucinda. And, really, Lucinda has said so much already about the program, but I really want to just start out with that during declared disasters, the U.S. Small Business Administration does provide low interest rate loans for homeowners and renters, as well as businesses of all sizes and most private nonprofits. The deadline is November 18th for physical damage, and that's a hard deadline. So we really encourage you to explore this program and the possibilities for it before that deadline, because after that, you will have an opportunity to request a late acceptance, but it might not be approved. Speaking of might not be approved, I wanted to say that this is really exciting, actually, that this community has received this declaration, because we do receive a lot of requests that don't receive it. And while this program won't make everything perfect, and there's still going to be a lot of work to be done, it really can save families a lot of money. As Lucinda was mentioning, with those favorable interest rates, the rates can be as low as 1.688, and they can be as high as 5.870, which is still lower than the number that Lucinda mentioned. So we encourage everyone to put the application in and find out how the program can work for you. As I mentioned, the SBA has 3 programs. It's for home damage, and it's for damage to personal property. So you don't have to necessarily own the home. People that maybe lost personal property, such as cars or appliances, that would be eligible. A property that has already been replaced, maybe on higher rate card, maybe a credit card or something like that, you can, those damages are still eligible, even if they've already been replaced. We do encourage people to keep their receipts so that you can prove that, but the first step is to put the application in, and the program is very used to working with people. And I will also say this, Lucinda mentioned that we have some people over at the Health and Human Services building, and they are going to be there until Thursday, October 6th. So that's really just next week. We only have a couple more days with them. They're there Monday through Friday, 8 a.m. to 5 p.m. So if possible, if you would like some assistance, it always feels a lot better to go through this sort of process with somebody, although you can start the process online. And as Lucinda mentioned, the link is available on the county page. You can always Google it, SBA Disaster Assistance Loan Application. I've done that. That's a very easy way to find it. But like I said, the people are only there until the close of business, which is 5 p.m. on October 6th. And I will also say this, our applications are processed in order received. And right now, as everyone's heard, there's a big event in Florida with Hurricane Ian. And so we're probably going to be getting a lot of applications for that. So I would encourage you, if at all possible, to try to get ahead of that wave of applications, because right now we've already had an application that got approved within 2 days. So, but that was a few days ago. So I would encourage you to do this sooner than later. Also, we have a program for economic injury, which is for businesses who are experiencing economic turndown. It's really to help them keep the doors and lights on and through the recovery period. The deadline for that isn't until June 19th. The most important one is coming up, November 18th. So also I want to say that it does include access roads and roads to the primary residence. So I've heard that that's also something that's very important here in this community. But the first step is to get that application in, and then working it out with the neighbors. And we have a legal team. Once an application is approved, you are assigned to a case manager in the legal department. Those case managers are paralegals, or attorneys, and they can help a community through the paperwork. So we really try to make it as less cumbersome or as simple as possible to go through the process, because we realize that disasters are already stressful. We also want to mention that damages to land associated with the primary residence or business operation is eligible. Also, there is a potential for mitigation, and mitigation can be an increase of up to 20% to put in a protective measure, such as a flood wall or elevating flood-prone structures or relocating utilities. I looked in our standard operating procedures. It also said potentially grading and contouring of the land. The thing is that we're not allowed to make those suggestions for you. You have to make the request. But if you have pre-existing devices that got damaged during the flooding, then those are eligible for full repair. And if there are code requirements that for protective devices that did not exist, then those are eligible for the complete cost, because it's required. So we really encourage you to get this application in and see what it would mean for you, because as Lucinda mentioned, if you are approved, you have up to 60 days to make that request. To sign the paperwork. You're not required to sign the paperwork, or you're not required to accept the loan. It would just be an option for you at that point. And as the adage goes, better to have and not need than need and not have. And so after the 18th of November, it is going to be difficult to secure the funding. So we encourage you to secure the funding ahead of time, because at that point, then you have options. You have up to that 60 days to accept the loan if you would like it. You can cancel it. And at that point, they send you a letter that says you have up to 6 months to request a reinstatement. So there is room for you once we get that application in. And once again, we encourage you to visit our Disaster Loan Outreach Center at the Health and Human Services building, because they're only going to be there until until October 6th. My apologies, October 6th, so really next week. And that is it. I would like to say, Lucinda, do you have anything that you think I should add for this community?
You know, I think you covered it well, Louise. Thank you so much. I just want to emphasize to people to apply and work through the process. Again, you can decide later if you don't want to go forward. If you're approved for a loan and you don't want to go forward, you can decide that later. But as she said, this is going to be likely a once in a time opportunity to take advantage of this and these very low rates.
Yes. And on that note as well, people don't need to wait for insurance, because sometimes insurance is not enough. And sometimes insurance doesn't pan out the way people are hoping for. So this program is very used to dealing with insurance. And if and when insurance comes in, the program isn't allowed to duplicate any of that. So the insurance can go to repay the loan, or it can just be worked out at that time. But sometimes people say to me they want to wait for insurance, and I don't encourage people to wait for insurance, because it can sometimes take a long time.
Well, in addition to that, I really want to emphasize, although in these corridors, not as many private roads, but in many areas we have a lot of private roads, and being able to utilize this funding, work together on a road and address the damages and impacts through this program is really an important opportunity for some that are out there. And then also the individual lot mitigation, which is what the term we use for the mitigation that she's speaking to. Certainly several people took advantage of that when we offered that through Natural Resources Conservation Service after Schultz in this corridor, particularly along Paintbrush. And so again, if you had damages to those facilities, to those measures that were constructed at that time, that's something that you can apply to help repair those. And if you know, as we work through this process, we may identify additional properties that need additional mitigation as well. And if you want to go down this path of adding that 20% for mitigation, then let us know. We'll work with you. If it's a flood wall, if it's a structure such as that, then you will have to seek a permit through community development and get a structural engineer to design it and so forth. But certainly the Chris and his team will work with you to look at where should that be placed. Obviously, we all want to be very conscious of not creating upstream or downstream negative impacts. And so if you want to look into that program, we'll work with you, like for berms and that type of thing, and very similar type things that we did on Paintbrush during post Schultz. So, well, thank you again, Louise. Again, we really appreciate you being out here and really helping our communities that have been impacted. So.
Thank you so much. It is absolutely our pleasure. And we really hope that people take advantage of this because it can really save people so much money. So
Absolutely.
Thank you so much for the opportunity.
All right, next slide, please. So I'm just going to take a few minutes, go ahead and go to the next slide. And for some of you that may be new to the area, I know I recognized a lot of names when I'm looking at the participants here. I recognize many of the names, and as we move through this process, we'll be having in-person meetings, but right now, we're at the preliminary stages. So, and we wanted to include a very large area in this communication. So we're doing the virtual route, but we'll get a chance to see you all. And most of you that were here through Schultz, I know of like, again, many of you, because I recognize your names. You know what was witnessed then. You were very severely impacted. These 3 corridors were very heavily impacted. And as you know, we did move forward with mitigation in these 3 corridors. Fortunately, up until this fire, it was very successful, and there were no impacts since the construction of those measures. It performed exceptionally well and did its job, as we want to say. So we mitigated a total of 5 watersheds during Schultz, and then did not in some of the mitigation in some of the watersheds now that are being affected. Government Tank, for example, had very limited burn impact during Schultz, and it did have some flooding, but certainly nothing like it's seen now, because that upper watershed, the very steep slopes up in Weatherford Canyon in that area hadn't probably burned in over 100 years. And they're seeing upwards of 22% increase, or 22 times increase in the level of flooding. But we had not pursued mitigation because of the limited impacts then. And then we also had 2 watersheds, Copeland and Peaceful, that declined mitigation at that time. And then, as you're also probably likely aware, there were a number of events that the district has sustained since then, more recently, of course, museum. And to date, we've spent in excess of $6 million in mitigating that effort. Again, the measures that we recently constructed there are having a very positive impact in that area, particularly the on-forest measures, and are really have done a great job this last summer. And then some of you would remember that in 2018, we had a 1,000-year rainfall event in the Brandis area, primarily focused on Brandis, kind of Peaceful Way area to the north of you. And here again, the mitigation measures there were amazingly were much more effective than one would have ever expected. But there were certainly impacts from that as well. So to date, the district spent well in excess. Now I think we're certainly up to or over 85 million addressing this post-wildfire flooding. And I want to say that I really want to commend the district board of directors, who are the supervisors, county supervisors. They made a decision this year to increase your flood control district tax to fund forest restoration, and with an emphasis on completing the work that we've been doing near Williams on Bill Williams Mountain, and then on the Upper Rio watershed. We now want to really turn our focus to the Upper Rio watershed and really focus on that area in partnership with the Forest Service as well as the city. and the National Forest Foundation, and we're working to try to get those projects launched. We just all can't afford to be going through this experience over and over and over again. And the only way we can mitigate these kinds of impacts is by conducting forest restoration. So really, we're working hard to try to hold on to those funds to be able to match federal funds and get that critical work done. Because I'll be honest, if the fire had run west instead of east, there wouldn't be a downtown Flagstaff right now. It would be just devastated. And the impacts from that would be whole incredibly catastrophic, and as are these in the area that's suffering now. So next slide, please. And in terms of what we've looked at going forward, both historically and now going forward, the real game changer is the on-forest watershed restoration measures. That has been shown true for museum and has been true for Schultz. We continue to really look to those measures to have a positive impact on reducing the sediment and frankly also reducing some level of the volume of flow. But unfortunately, what was designed during Schultz worked great for many years. And these corridors between let's say we constructed Campbell in 2014, and then the 2 Paintbrush corridors in 2015. So we had, 7-8 years there of success, but now we're just seeing such greater flows that it is having an impact in those areas. So next slide, please. So just some of the, what's been experienced and some of the information about the rainfall this monsoon season. Go ahead to the next slide, Sean. I think everybody's aware of the fire, and this says 42 major flood events. We're actually up to over 40. I think we're at 45 or 46 now. And, just tremendous amount of flooding experience this year. And what you're going to see in a few minutes is that we've had a fair amount of rainfall this year, some corridors above average. But we haven't had any really large events. They've all been very small rainfall events. And we're still seeing horrible flooding. So that doesn't bode well for these watersheds. These watersheds desperately need restoration, and obviously we're working hard to try to secure the funding to move forward with that. This is a photograph on the right here. Is in August, we co-hosted with Congressman O'Halloran a meeting, and we brought in high-level officials from the Forest Service as well as the U.S. Department of Agriculture, Department of Transportation, and we toured the area, and there was a big flood event in the Campbell corridor that day. And it was great, frankly, because they got to see your world. They got to experience, and we turned up Crisp Hill, and we thought we may be out there for a while, and we ended up being able to drive out, but they got to see what this looks like, and floodwater going down Campbell and the impacts that were sustained that day. And certainly Congressman Halloran actually had been out there in other events. He's been out many, many times, but a lot of those officials had never seen post-wildfire flooding. And so this was a real eye-opener. Next slide, please. This is a chart that we once we received the burned area emergency response team's map of the burn severity for the pipeline fire. We had continually been running the analysis, making some assumptions about burn severity, but once we received that and we ran what we kind of considered the final modeling, this shows you what the increase in the flooding is. Those red bars are the bars associated with post-pipeline fire. And then the little orange bars are post-tunnel fire of which there was very limited effect in most of the areas. And then the blue is modeling that we ran after we completed all of the mitigation measures in 2015. Then we came back in 2016. There was a discussion and a process that went through to determine the level of recovery on forest. And there was some new modeling run at that time. And so this shows you the comparison from that point to now and what we're seeing. And those in the red circle there is the Campbell Rope Arabian watershed, Siesta Paintbrush, which is also known as North Paintbrush, and then Paintbrush Siesta, which is known as South Paintbrush. And you can see what the increase is there. And you can see to the right is Government Tank and how severely impacted it was. And then to the far left, the Wupaki Trails, Lennox watershed has been really heavily impacted as well. Both those watersheds burned much more severely up on the steep slopes. But all the watersheds sustained some very serious damage. So next slide, please. So the district undertook to produce, we set a goal early on to produce 1 million sandbags, and we did reach that goal. And fortunately, we have a stockpile in place for next year now. We placed over 4 miles of concrete barrier. There were lots of, the engineers worked around the clock preparing the mitigation exhibits, and there was the fires had actually damaged a number of the measures on forest, and those had to be repaired and then prepared for the flooding. And there were a number of other things that were done to clear out channels and those types of things. And we did secure some funding through Nrcs, Emergency Watershed Protection Exigency, which means emergency funding. And that's specifically for barriers and sandbags. We've probably spent in excess of double that, though, on those measures. But some money is better than no money, that's for sure. So we really appreciate their support of those efforts. It's pretty likely that the district will spend upwards or more than $7 million just in response and short-term mitigation from this summer. So next slide, please. This is some rainfall totals from this year, and you can see the chart, the bars on the left-hand side, I know this is a little hard to read, are actually the upper Campbell watershed, or the Campbell watershed. We have gauges, as I think pretty much everyone is aware. We have a set of several gauges. We've added 3 more gauges this year for some of the newer burn areas. These are the gauges that have been in place since Schultz and measuring the rainfall. And these are the rainfall totals for this year. So you can see for Upper Campbell, it's just a little over 10 inches. Paintbrush gauge is just a little under 10 inches. And then the landfill gauge is a little over 12 inches. And that is almost actually double what the historic average has been there. And so a lot of people in Donny Park not only did some certainly experience flooding from the Government Tank watershed, but they also experienced the combination of a lot of rainfall in Donny Park itself this year. So that was a major contributing factor to flooding in that area. So again, we've had probably a higher than normal level of precipitation. Then go to the next slide. This is most of the major events, and we didn't necessarily capture every corridor that was impacted, but the ones that were highly impacted, we captured here through the season. This is through September 10th, the last major event. And one thing I want to point out is that far right column, it says max reoccurrence interval. So you'll hear people talk about 100-year flood or a 100-year rainfall event or a 50-year rainfall event. Or we talked about the 1,000-year rainfall event in the Brandis corridor in 2018. You'll note there that the largest event that we had was 5 to 10 years. That's a small event, you know, but a typical event, but a much smaller event than has been seen historically in these watersheds. So when you look at that information and you realize, whoa, look at the level of flooding we experienced, and we didn't even have any really large events. We didn't have a 25-year event, a 50-year event. You know, that's obviously concerning to all of us, that the potential in these watersheds remains great for very catastrophic flooding and continued catastrophic flooding. So next slide, please. So I want to take a few minutes to talk about kind of the big picture for the overall 9 watersheds. What have we identified in terms of a long-term flood mitigation plan? And I want to emphasize right now up front that this is what we've identified as being needed, and that we think will have a pretty positive impact in the various flood corridors impacted. But this is all contingent, as I mentioned right up front, on receiving significant federal and state funding. And you're going to get to see what this cost is. You know, some of you'll remember we spent upwards of, I think it was about 40 million total to mitigate Schultz, of which we got a fairly significant contribution of federal funding. A lot of things have changed since then, and the rules that apply to these fundings, and what's eligible, what isn't eligible, and the current dynamics with funding for these types of projects is there are no funds in where we would normally seek. So we're going to have to seek congressional appropriations. And again, Congressman O'Halloran and Senator Kelly and Senator Sinema are working on our behalf. In fact, Supervisor Vasquez is in Washington, D.C. right now, meeting with congressional members and departments about the need for this funding. And they're doing a great job really supporting us and working with appropriations and other entities within Congress to try to deliver this funding. But it will all be contingent. If we get less, we'll have to do less. There's just no way that, given the price tag, the district and county could ever sustain this level of investment. So once again, we're using 3 integrated strategies on forest watershed restoration. Again, that's critical. Flood mitigation in the neighborhoods, and then highway drainage improvements that are needed to integrate that entire system, both east and west of Highway 89. So next slide, please. So the on-forest proposed work areas, I know this is a little hard to see, and note that Alan's going to go into detail relative to Campbell and the Paintbrush watersheds, but you can see those blue kind of blobs on the map here are areas that are slated for alluvial fans, either new fans, if it's a corridor where we had not done prior construction, such as in the government tank area above Heppel switchback area there. And then there's a lot of grade control. We're looking at over 1,000 new grade control features throughout the corridors to effectuate reduction in sediment and stabilize either existing fans that are up there. But frankly, most of the fans that are on forest now that were not restored during Schultz have been seriously deteriorated. They've completely unraveled. All the unmitigated watersheds are pretty much unraveled now, and are going to require some really significant repair. You can see here it says 35 to 40 million. We've actually upped that by 5 million just with the impacts that happened during August. So next slide, please. And then this next slide outlines the costs for each of those. And this does show that we're pretty close to 40 million now. This is an estimate, again, based on preliminary plan that Natural Channel Design is developing. And you can see that the Campbell and Paintbrush corridors are identified here for work as well. So a significant investment. We are working very closely with the Forest Service, both at the federal, regional, and state level, or at the local level, forest level, to secure this funding in its entirety from the Forest Service. And that's our goal. Don't know if we'll be successful, but again, we have strong congressional support working with us to get appropriations for appropriate disaster relief funding. So next slide, please. Then moving to flood mitigation in the neighborhoods. Similarly, what we did in the Campbell corridor, much of the other corridors that don't have mitigation are looking at very similar types of improvements with concrete channels, box culverts, to reduce those impacts within the neighborhoods. We're looking at new flood mitigation in 3 of the flood corridors: Peaceful Way, Copeland. Copeland's going to involve 2 channels, as well as Government Tank. And then within the other corridors, including Campbell, and it looks like I left Campbell out of there, that my bad. Campbell and South and North Paintbrush, we're looking at some level of expansion and or stabilization in those corridors. So, and the total cost for that effort is upwards of $55 million. So next slide, please. And then the third piece of the highway drainage improvements. We actually met today with Federal Highways. Some of you may remember that we sought and received about $6.5 million to construct the Copeland Detention Facility during Schultz, and we're seeking that same type of funding. It's called emergency relief funding through the Department of Transportation to hopefully effectuate some other improvements that are going to be needed, both to be able to mitigate impacts to the highway, but also to frankly accommodate some of the increases in capacity that are needed based on some of the improvements that we want to make and just the level of flooding that's taking place right now. So whether we'll be successful in securing all that funding or not, who knows, but we had a great meeting today outlining what we see as the needs, and ADOT is moving forward to bring on an engineer to begin to look at engineering some of these measures. Some of the things they've already agreed they're going to move forward with, and some we still are going to require additional discussion and continuing to pursue that. So, and that total is in the ballpark of 45 million. So next slide, please. So this summarizes the overall mitigation costs for the entire plan. Again, on forest, we're looking probably upwards of 40 to possibly as high as 45 million. Flood mitigation in the neighborhoods, 50 to 55 million. And then highway likely in the $45 million range. And so for a total price tag of 130 to 145 million. The county probably has never spent that amount of money in its entire history. Certainly Schultz was the last largest project in history of the county. And it was, like I said, in the ballpark over about 5 years. I think we spent upwards of 40 to 50 million total with different various funding sources, largely NRCS, Emergency Watershed Protection funding. Unfortunately, in 2016, there was a decision made that that funding could no longer be used to fund on forest measures. So now it can only fund measures on private property or within public right-of-ways. So we're having to identify other funding sources through the Forest Service for those measures now. Next slide, please. So talking a little bit about it, again, just want to reemphasize that this magnitude of funding is obviously significant, that we're requesting through the federal, largely through the federal government as well as state. And, we must have ultimate plan. We must match the funding, right? There's also none of these projects can be funded in entirety by the state or feds, so the district will have to match that, and there's going to be some level of limitation to that ability to match. So, but right now, our full focus is on working with our congressional delegation to try to get the appropriations needed, both for the Emergency Watershed Protection Program and for various programs within the Forest Service. Largely, they have a disaster release funding mechanism as well. I just learned about recently, as in today, and they're seeking funding. Again, we're working at the federal and regional and forest level on those efforts. So next slide, please. We have made application to the NRCS. We've submitted an initial application fairly quickly for 5 watersheds. These were all watersheds that had been involved in the original Schultz application back in 2011 timeframe, 2010, 2011 time, well, 2011 time frame, 2011, 2012 timeframe. And given that we had worked with NRCS within these corridors prior, some of the involvement and work that would need to be conducted, for example, NEPA approvals and those type of things, is much more streamlined because of that prior work. So we wanted to get something in very quickly. Right now, there is a $600 million, I'll say, deficit or project waiting list in the EWPP program. And we want to get our projects onto that waiting list as quickly as we can. So we submitted this application. It does include converting the upper section of the Campbell Channel from TRM to Shot Creek, providing that will provide some additional expansion in capacity. And so it did not, though, include government tank and paintbrush corridors. I'll move on to that next. Go to the next slide, please. This is what was included in the original application. And they deemed some of the cost, and it's kind of interesting, frankly, the safety measures associated with these channels now are not eligible for reimbursement. So safety railing on channels, fencing is not eligible for reinvestment. So you'll see there's a grand total of about 24 million. We were approved for 19.6 million, of which then if the program gets funded by Congress, we would then we would contribute 25% plus have to cover the ineligible costs, because obviously we're going to install the safety measures, and then RCS would cover 75%. And this project has been placed on the project wait list. Next slide, please. We're in the process of submitting right now. We're working with Arizona NRCS staff to submit an application right now for the government tank flood corridor. Approximate cost is about 26 million for that. It's a very complicated and complex corridor, and we hope to have that finalized and sent off to DC this week is our goal. We've submitted it. We're working back and forth with them on what's eligible and ineligible. And then we're also preparing a third NRC application for the paintbrush flood corridors, and also to construct across the entire flood area some level of individual lot mitigation where needed. And we're going through a process now to identify some of those properties that we think post mitigation would still be at risk for some level of flooding. So that third application, I'm going to be submitting the letter of intent this week, and then we work through a process with them to ultimately submit that application. And you'll hear more from Chris Duza in terms of what would be included in that, in terms of the measures, in terms of enhancements to the existing mitigation within the paintbrush corridors. So next slide. All right, well, I'm now going to turn it over. We're looking at instituting the same set of strategies, although highway drainage is less involved with these set of corridors than many of the other corridors. I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Alan Hayden, and he's going to discuss what we're looking at in terms of on-forest watershed restoration efforts. Alan?
Great. Thanks. Good evening, everybody. You go to the next slide. And there we go. Good. So I just wanted to start out by, for those of you that haven't had a chance to get up and walk up into the forest and take a look at things, this give you an idea of what the current conditions are up there. This huge increase in water post pipeline means that we have reactivated the alluvial fans and all the channels up on the forest. A lot of this is happening
Looks like Alan froze up.
what's that?
Alan, you froze up there for a bit.
Well, how's that?
We can hear you now.
Okay.
You may
So,
have
yeah.
to turn off your video. You may have to turn off your video and try it without video so that we can hear you.
I'm sure everybody's still looking at me. So anyway, a little bit about the watershed conditions. If you didn't hear that, the huge amount of flow after the pipeline fire has reactivated the existing alluvial fans and reactivated the channels. Been a lot of activity up high in the watershed, lots of gullying coming across the Waterline Road and across the 420 road, building and rebuilding fans, and then moving sediment down the hill. And you guys have seen the result of that down in the neighborhoods. So we can go on to the next slide. So again, this is kind of what it looks like here. We get big cuts off the really steep portions. It comes out onto alluvial fan surfaces above the 420 road. The one on the left is the South Paintbrush fan above the 420. Spreads out, does its work, recollects itself, and then cuts back through some of that piled up sediment and carries it further down, creates another fan. And so these fans building and then cutting and then building and cutting and marching themselves down until the constructed fans, which are right above the neighborhood. And those the fan surfaces in the neighborhoods, right above the neighborhoods, have remained for the most part intact and have done their job really well. We are seeing them collect 85 to 95% of the sediment that goes across them. It just as they were intended to do. But we can go to the next slide. And that's caused quite a bit of an aggradation on those. It caused quite a bit of aggradation in the terminal trenches, which serve to collect that widespread water and put it into a transition channel and get it down into the conveyances through the neighborhood. Those transition channels have been overwhelmed by this huge increase in flow as well. So the flows that are in excess of the design flows have gone back onto the existing fan surfaces and spread out where they as were intended for flows that were beyond the design flow. But we have had to clean out those trenches, several of them several times this year to make sure that they continue to work. And we have had to put in new grade control in some of the transition channels as well, just to keep them from eroding because of the excess flows that are coming out. So that work is ongoing. We are likely to finish up our final kind of repairs, if you will, to the Campbell corridor by the end of next week, and then move on to more long-term stuff. So I'll go on to the next slide. So for long-term mitigation that we're considering, if we can find funding for it, this is kind of Lucinda showed you the overall idea of 9 different watersheds and how we're going to work in those watersheds. But this is the close-up of the Campbell Paintbrush watersheds. And you can see that we're, the alluvial fan systems above the 420 road, kind of off to the left side of this map here, are, they're building and cutting and building and cutting. And what we need to do is get to above the 420 road or just below the 420 road where they're starting to cut and solidify them into place. So continue to be stable in place. And then that means working on the 420 road crossings, which all the road crossings tend to concentrate flows rather than spread them out. And so we need to make sure that they don't become the head cuts. Further down towards the neighborhood, you'll see those dark green areas right above the private property and Forest Service boundaries. We're looking at expanding the terminal trenches and expanding the transition channels out to the neighborhood, depending upon what kind of flow we can fit through the neighborhood. And Chris is going to talk a little bit about what that's going on. The terminal trenches and transition channels, if you recall, serve to kind of meter out the flows as they come across these bands, spread out. We collect them in the terminal trench, and then we meter them out through the transition channels so that we don't overwhelm the channels that go through the neighborhood and cause an adverse impact to where those channels are. There is the potential to expand these transition channels somewhat, depending upon how much additional flow can go down through the corridors in the neighborhoods. And we're looking at that. And we're also looking at improving the substrate in those. We've got good grade control in them now, but we need to kind of tidy them up and get the substrate back in so it's a little heavier and will resist the higher flows that we're currently experiencing. And also for the terminal trench itself, Paintbrush, that is our last existing log structure left from the Schultz. All of the other log structures that were built in all the other watersheds got burned in either the tunnel or the pipeline fire and had to be replaced. This is the last one. It's worked really well all summer long, but those logs are getting pretty tired. And so replacing them with rock seems like an expedient thing to do. So we can go on to the next slide. So, and just to remind everybody, the goal of this on-forest watershed restoration is a reduction in sediment source and sediment transport and we do that through the restoration of channels and alluvial fans. The reason that we need to keep the sediment down to a dull roar is because all the pipes, all the channels through the neighborhoods operate on the basis of being relatively free of sediment. When you have this huge amount come down, clogs up all channels, and it's caught, and then they work and spreads flows everywhere and causes a big issue. So far this summer, we've had things on the forest that worked pretty well, but we've got to up our game, and especially on the upper portion of the watershed. And so that will mean a restoration of alluvial fans and restoration of channels. And this is an example of a alluvial fan restoration that was done on the museum fire over the east side. That's these alluvial fans get overwhelmed and get big gullies cut through them, like what's on the left side there. 5 foot deep gully, And that becomes a huge sediment source where there was no sediment source before. So what we do, spread that flow out by filling in the gully. And that same site is depicted on the top right photo, where the restored alluvial fan, and you can actually see water running over it this summer, spreading out, not cutting, going slow, and dropping out its sediment. So that's the function that we're trying to achieve with these on-forest watershed restoration. The water, in the most part, is still going to come, but what we can do is reduce the speed at which it comes, reduce the depth at which it goes across the land, and reduce its erosivity, and actually get it to start dropping sediment out onto the forest instead of getting down into the pipes and the channels inside the neighborhood. So next slide, please. So some of these practices, all the practices that we're recommending for the forest are, using native materials, large rocks, building rock sills or log sills across the alluvial fan surfaces, like we see in the top left and the top left photos, or in more confined channels, building grade control structures, cross vein weirs, very large rocks like what you can see being built in these others. They're same practices that we utilized for the Schultz restoration work, and they've worked really well. We just need to build them bigger and build them more of them in different places right now, given the new flooding regime. So next slide, please. Again, alluvial fan restoration, building sills to keep it from eroding, and then revegetation. And again, this is from Museum Fire, Spruce Avenue Wash, just completed this summer, and has worked really well through the course of the summer. So, and this is a hydroseeding operation. So we come back in, reseed the area with native seed to hold the soils together and provide some long-term resistivity to erosion. So next slide. So for those of you that have been around since through the Schultz activities, you know what these kind of construction activities look like. It does take large equipment, excavators, bulldozers, lots of trucks and yellow machinery running around on the fan surfaces to try to get them even, install the grade control and do that. It can take a month or two to put some of these watersheds back together, but it's well worth the effort when we can get it to go right. So next slide. So I'm going to turn it over to Chris Duza with Civil Tech, and he's going to talk a little bit about things that are more in the neighborhood. So
thank you, Alan. And folks, we are really very fortunate to have the team that we had for Schultz back together again, working on all these different elements, and to have their experience and knowledge, and to be able to move very quickly. That has afforded us to be able to move very quickly and put some great forward efforts very quickly. So really want to thank Alan. Thank you, Alan. And now we'll turn it over to Chris. So as those of you that weren't here, Chris designed the mitigation measures for the paintbrush corridors, and was instrumental in many of the other corridors, and engineered several of the other measures as well. So thank you, Chris.
All right, thanks, Lucinda. Well, good evening, everyone. I'm Chris Duza with Civil Tech Engineering, and I'm going to speak a little bit tonight about the flood mitigation that will be within the neighborhoods. So next slide, please. So I know Lucinda covered this quite a bit, but a little bit of a recap from post 2013, or the post Schultz improvements. you know, these watersheds, the North and South Paintbrush and the Campbell watersheds, burned pretty severely back in Schultz. And the corridor improvements in these areas were based on some modeling that was done after Schultz, which accounted for about 2 years of watershed recovery that had occurred after the fire. So typically immediately after the fire, like we've been experiencing this monsoon season, is where we really get the most significant amount of runoff and sediment and debris. And then through time, naturally, you know, the watersheds do begin to recover somewhat on their own. And really, you know, the work that Alan's talking about on completing on the forest is really an acceleration of that watershed, that recovery that may occur naturally over a period of decades, but you know, we're really trying to accelerate that into a very short time frame. So again, 2 years of watershed recovery, natural watershed recovery after Schultz, and the design discharge for the Campbell corridor through the neighborhood was about 530 CFS, and then for North and South Paintbrush was roughly 250 CFS. Next slide, please. So some of the considerations, again, with the post-Schultz design, part of the funding requirements with the Nrcs, which really funded a lot of these improvements, which is typical for a lot of the federal funding, or just about all the federal funding, as far as I know, is achieving a positive cost-benefit ratio. So as we move forward with the work that we're planning on doing, you know, we'll have to meet that same requirement. So we were able to achieve that cost-benefit ratio back in 2013, and the district, like Lucinda had mentioned, had to cover an extensive amount of the costs that were associated with the neighborhood improvements because they weren't covered by our funding partner, being the Nrcs. So things like paving, the paving of the roads along Paintbrush, and the work that was done in Hutchison Acres with the storm drain and the repaving of Lee Drive and the other streets there, as well as a lot of the utility relocations. There were quite a bit of utility work that were done in these corridors, and that work was not covered by the Nrcs grant and had to be covered by the county and the flood control district. A very important part of the work that we do throughout the neighborhoods and at the highway and on the east side of the highway as well is called no adverse impacts modeling. And so there's another consultant, the same consultant that's been doing a lot of the modeling that we've been discussing throughout the presentation, will take the improvements that we actually design and then rerun those models to make sure that we're not having any adverse impacts on properties or structures or the highway as a result of the work that we're doing. So we don't want to do anything that diverts the water from where it is naturally flowing now, and we certainly don't want to increase maybe the depth of flow or the velocities of flow in areas where it would have adverse impacts on property. So it's a very important part of what we do as we develop these alternatives and look at doing the work in the neighborhoods that we don't have any adverse impacts throughout the neighborhood. So, you know, we constructed various types of improvements in these corridors, including open channels. You know, you see the open channels along the Campbell corridor. Those were constructed at various times throughout the flood events that happened post-Schultz, as well as, you know, box culverts, and of course, you know, the culverts at the various road crossings in the Paintbrush corridors. And those corridors also included some 5-foot diameter storm drains. And again, I mentioned a little bit before, there was an awful lot of the utility and roadway work that had to be done associated with these corridors after Schultz. So next slide, please. So a little bit, you know, here's a couple photos that show some of the improvements that were constructed after the Schultz fire. On the left-hand side, you see a channel that was constructed in the Paintbrush corridor, and it's constructed with what's called a turf reinforcement mat, or you've probably heard the term TRM, and that's what we're referring to as this turf reinforcement mat. And so it's a mat that is placed over an earthen channel that is hydro-seeded as well, and the goal is to provide protection against erosion with the mat, and then of course, you know, a key component of that is the revegetation that occurs coming up through the mat, and you can see a little bit of the growth happening in that particular photograph. And then again, in the Campbell corridor, you know, the photo there on the right represents, I believe that's at Henry Drive. You know, there was one box culvert in the channel there, and at Henry and at the Chevron station, you know, those crossings were expanded from one box culvert to 3. So there's a, you know, a little bit of history about some of the work that was done in these corridors associated with the Schultz fire. So next slide, please. Again, a couple of photographs from, these are, I believe both of these are from the Paintbrush corridor. You can see the 5-foot diameter storm drain that was constructed in that corridor. And then on the right-hand side in the upper right is actually one of the inlets to the storm drain system. And as Alan mentioned, where the work that's done on the forest with the alluvial fans and the terminal trenches, and then the transition channels that come from the forest into the neighborhoods. These structures were constructed on both north and south paintbrush to take those flows from the transition channels and put them into the storm drain system. So next slide, please. So a little bit about 2022 and the post pipeline fire. I guess it's all, you know, post pipeline and post tunnel fire would be more accurate. But again, these watersheds were burned again in the pipeline and the tunnel fire. You know, who would have thought 10 years later we would be back at the same place that we were, you know, after Schultz with these watersheds. We had, you know, quite a bit of recovery that had occurred after Schultz up until these fires that had occurred. And as Lucinda had mentioned, you know, things on forest and things through the neighborhood were really functioning very well until these fires occurred this year. So as Lucinda said in her part of the presentation, as you saw in the various graphics, we've seen a tremendous increase in the amount of sediment, debris, and stormwater runoff that's coming out of these watersheds as a result of the fires. And in these particular watersheds, we modeled that 2-inch 45-minute storm, which is about a 25-year recurrence interval. And that didn't account for any watershed recovery. So we're really looking at the watersheds in an immediate post-burn situation. And so the discharge coming out of the Campbell watershed is about 1,200 CFS for this event. And then both in North and South Paintbrush, it's roughly around 900 CFS for that event. So, you know, considerably more, considerably higher than those original design discharges that we're seeing in the post-Schultz era. So, you know, what we want to do in the moving forward with these corridors in these areas is obviously we want to utilize those existing improvements that are in place as much as we possibly can. So we want to utilize those existing alignments, the existing channels, the existing storm drains, culvert crossings. We already have easements and right-of-way and environmental clearances in all these areas. So it's really to our benefit to try to use these not only for speed and the speed of design and the speed of construction, but also it makes the most sense from a cost standpoint as well. So next slide. So a goal in these corridors in Paintbrush and for Campbell is going to be to you know, stabilize those damaged portions of the Schultz corridor improvements. You know, we've seen damage in the upper part of the Campbell channel where the turf reinforcement mat is in the upper part of the channel between the shotcrete sections that has been severely damaged by these flows. And so we'll look to possibly expand and stabilize that damage. And of course, you know, you've seen as well in the paintbrush corridors, where we've had some damage to that turf reinforcement mat in various places. And really, you know, in a lot of the areas where that mat has been damaged is where the vegetation has not, did not take very well. The revegetation didn't take in that channel, and we've seen some failure in that channel and some significant erosion there. So again, we want to look at the infrastructure that we have in place, look at opportunities where we can increase the capacity where it's feasible. Again, we'll have to meet that criteria of a positive cost-benefit ratio, which, you know, really shouldn't be a problem in these corridors. And again, have to take a look at the no adverse impacts modeling that would be done by that independent team. But again, you know, using the alignments and using to a great degree the infrastructure that's in place, I don't anticipate that we'll have a problem with that either. So next slide, please. So again, so what we're planning right now, what we know we can do right now is, as I had mentioned, is to remove that damaged TRM channel, which is in the upper part of the Campbell corridor. I believe that should be completed by the end of this week. I had talked to the contractor earlier today, and now that things have kind of settled down a little bit with the rainfall and a lot of the work going on in a lot of the other corridors, they'll be able to pull that TRM channel out, and ultimately we will we'll be replacing that with a fully lined shotcrete channel. And then on north and south paintbrush, again, we can look at replacing and revegetating the damaged TRM channel. And again, the revegetation is really critical to the success of that type of channel. Could possibly involve, you know, an irrigation system to make sure that we get good irrigation in that channel, you know, or we may just replace it with shotcrete. So there's several alternatives there to replace and expand the capacity of that channel. And a little bit more difficult to increase the capacity of the storm drain system. I think what really limits us right now with our storm drain system, as well as the culverts going underneath the various roadway crossings, is really the inlets. And it's the ability to get more water into that storm drain and to be able to push more water through the storm drain. So we're in the process of looking at how we can hydraulically increase the efficiency of those inlets and try to really maximize, you know, what we can do with our existing infrastructure that's there. So next slide, please. So a couple of photographs here. I had mentioned the TRM channel along the upper Campbell corridor improvements. The photo on the left there is a pretty good depiction of how that TRM channel has been damaged by the sediment and the flows that are coming out of the forest. And then, of course, you know, in the upper right-hand part of the slide, there is a shotcrete line channel. You can see that it's got a little bit of damage there, but it certainly has fared much better than the TRM channel that was constructed after Schultz. So next slide, please. So again, a little bit about the TRM channels. This is in Paintbrush. You can see on the left-hand side of the screen there a photograph of where that TRM channel has failed, where it's failed, and that the channel is now severely eroded coming through the corridor, as opposed to the photograph on the right, which really is pretty well vegetated and really handled those flows very well with very little damage to that channel. So again, we may have an opportunity to either put TRM back in that channel and really make an effort to revegetate it, or replace it with shotcrete lining. So next slide, please. And so with that, I'll turn it back over to Lucinda.
All right, thank you, Chris. And again, really appreciate the team that we have, and Chris is looking at, you know, what are the options in terms of expansion of that system, and you know, what would be involved. And so both on the paintbrush corridors and as well as at Campbell. So, and then simultaneously, then Alan would then be looking at how to upsize some of the transition channels and the terminal trenches as well to accommodate more water. So we'll continue to put effort to that, at least to some degree, until we get federal funding and hopefully can secure that funding and move forward. And again, that's key to all of this. All of it is key, is getting the congressional action to fund EWPP and the on-forest measures. The federal highways program is actually funded. It's more of a discussion of what's going to be eligible under that program. And if it's not eligible under emergency relief, then what other programs? There are some other potential funding options through Department of Transportation. Unfortunately, they're much slower to access and very competitive. So again, once we secure the funding, then we would move forward with really moving from basically conceptual engineering into preliminary engineering. And through that process, as those of you will remember, we will, and Chris noted, we'll conduct the no adverse impact analysis for any of the improvements that we make within the area to ensure that we're not creating any impacts either upstream or downstream. That's a key element of this process, has been from day one and will continue to be. That's a key policy now for any of the work that the district does anywhere in the county. In terms of this easement, these corridors, I don't anticipate that we will need any additional easements or the associated mortgage releases, as you'll all recall, many of you will recall. However, we may need some temporary construction easements to come in and make the repairs and so forth. In most cases, I think we can access those based upon what was secured for those measures initially. So I don't think we'll need many of those, but there may be a location or two that might be needed. And if that's the case, obviously we'll reach out and have that conversation with you specifically. Then we would finalize the engineering. We have to, of course, work with the Forest Service for the on-forest measures. They have the environmental processes underway right now for those areas that are not within the current National Environmental Policy Act clearance areas through Schultz. And so for the expansions of what we're talking about on forest, those do need NEPA approval for those expansion areas. And they are diligently working on that right now and hope to have those clearance areas for these corridors done by March is the goal. So, and then of course, if we do secure that EWP funding, working with them to get the projects approved, the actual designs approved, and to work through that process with them. And then of course, also the flood control district has to approve the match for the grants and cover the ineligible costs. So that will be a whole process there as well. We met with the board on September 20th and walked through a lot of information, looking at the financial implications and so forth of all of this. And if you have an interest in that, you can go to both either the Schultz Pipeline website, and a link to that meeting's there if you would like to listen to it. It's a long meeting, I'll forewarn you. And then we're having another meeting on October 18th, another meeting with the board, and we'll be meeting with the board at least monthly, and we're meeting with them individually as well to walk through, where we're going and what this plan is and the whole financial implications of this. So then, of course, we have to engage in the contracting process, and we have very limited construction seasons here, and a short, relatively short window in the spring and a short window in the fall. And that will always influences our ability to actually get work done. But right now, the focus is securing the funding. And so And again, we're working very diligently on that, very actively, and hope that we will see that be forthcoming sometime within the next several months, hopefully, if not sooner. So we all know it's a political year, and there's a lot of dynamics at play. So it's election year. So next slide, Sean. So with that, we're going to conclude our presentation. And if you have specific questions, I'd like you to go to the Pipeline Fire Flood Area email. Again, that's an email. You can also contact us if you want to receive the regular email updates. And we're pretty good about trying to get updates out at least once a week, if not more frequently. And really encourage you to sign up for those. And we do not sell the emails. We do not share them with others. So it's a safe way to keep up to date of what's happening in the flood area and get critical information like about the SBA program and any other programs that are going to be made available to the flood area. So again, really, if you do have questions, please email us. That's the best way. Then when I get those emails, myself and Mark, then we can identify who is appropriate to answer those and work with the engineers or whoever's involved, whether it's a question for me or whoever, to answer those and get back to you. So, and again, we will, as we move forward with this, probably frankly, based upon, again, when we get congressional approval and get some funding moving forward, we'll be having individual meetings to look more specifically at the corridors, but at this point, we wanted to get the information out now and keep you informed as to how things are moving forward and reassure you that we do understand that you're being impacted, and we are looking at ways to reduce those impacts. So wish you all a good evening. And I know we're getting a little bit of rain out there right now. I've been looking at the weather radar, and the flood director is on, been communicating with him. It looks like it's going to pass through fairly quickly. It doesn't look like it's going to be heavy, but we all know you never know. So we have our flood director that's on, again, 24 hours a day, monitoring things until we get through, and we may have a monsoon season that actually goes through the 30th, which is the official end of the monsoon season this year. So again, thank you for hanging in there with us. It's been a really rough year, a rough summer, and know that we are committed to trying to move this forward in the best way that we can with whatever resources we can lay our hands on, and do the best that we can to try to reduce the suffering and impacts to all of you. So hang in there with us, and we'll be in touch soon as with any kind of updates. Thank you.